Elias made them feel powerless, and they didn't know why. He rarely spoke unless he had to. He answered calmly, never raised his voice, never rebelled. But there was a look, just a flicker, that sometimes crossed his face when he saw a whip raised, or when a child was dragged by the arm, or when a mother's cry echoed across the fields. In that flicker lived a storm so quiet it frightened even those who believed themselves unbreakable. Despite all this, Elias was respected among the enslaved. Children ran to him when they scraped their knees. Women trusted him to help repair cabins or lift heavy logs. The old men called him Silent Mountain, because when he stood still, he had the weight and patience of one. And indeed he carried himself like a man built from stone and shadow. But there was something else about him, something buried so deeply that even he tried to ignore it. The plantation owner, Horace Langston, often watched Elias with an expression somewhere between fear and curiosity. Elias didn't know why, until one night when the truth came in whispers carried by the wind. Langston's wife, an aging woman named Miriam, once had a younger sister, a girl who loved wandering the woods, picking flowers and telling stories to the enslaved children when no one was watching. She vanished 22 years ago, swallowed by the forest, never found again. But before she disappeared, she had a child no white man claimed, a child no enslaved woman gave birth to, a child Miriam swore she heard crying one winter morning before the cabin door slammed shut and the midwife warned her never to speak of it again. Rumor said Miriam's sister had fallen in love with a runaway who lived in the swamps. Rumor said the baby survived. Rumor said Langston knew. Elias never asked if the rumors were about him. He didn't need to. He had always felt a strange pull toward the woods, an instinct to survive without being taught, a memory of being held by arms he didn't recognize, and the knowledge that the owner flinched every time their eyes met. Whether Elias was the child of a runaway or not no longer mattered. What mattered was what people believed, and belief on a plantation was more powerful than truth. It was belief that made the overseers keep their distance, belief that made the owner uneasy, belief that made whispers rise whenever Elias walked past. Some called him lucky, others called him cursed, but all of that would have been manageable if not for the overseer's son, William Tarrow. William was 19, pale as milk, with a cruel streak thicker than the cane stalks. He returned from Savannah after 2 years of schooling, determined to learn the trade of running a plantation. Those words were enough to make every enslaved worker dread his return. School had not taught him compassion. It had sharpened his arrogance. From the moment William saw Elias, he hated him. He hated Elias's calmness, his silence, his refusal to cower. He hated the way the other enslaved people looked at Elias with trust rather than fear. Most of all, he hated that his father spoke Elias's name with caution rather than command. One afternoon, while the sun sank like a burning coin in the sky, William approached Elias near the wagon trail. He carried a whip, not dangling it casually, but gripping it like he had waited years for this moment. Elias continued stacking logs, pretending not to notice the boy's heavy breathing or the sweat beading around his temples. "What's that look you always got?" William spat. "Think you're better than the rest? Think you're some kind of king out here?" Elias didn't answer. He didn't flinch. He simply lifted another log. That silence was gasoline. William struck. The whip cracked through the air like a lightning serpent. Elias did not move, but the log slipped from his hands, not from fear, but from restraint. His fingers tightened, his jaw clenched, but he stood still. William wanted fear. He wanted pain. But Elias gave him none. The boy's fury doubled. "Look at me!" he screamed. Slowly Elias raised his head, and William saw something in his eyes he'd never seen before, something far too calm, far too knowing, far too fearless. It broke William. "I'll break you," he whispered, breath trembling. The second strike was harder, the third even harder. Elias's shirt tore, blood seeped through the cotton. The workers nearby froze in terror, watching, praying, begging silently for Elias not to fight back, because the fight would be his death. But it wasn't Elias who broke the moment. It was the fire. The lantern William dropped in his rage tipped and rolled toward the dry grass. A flame caught, small at first, then roaring as the wind pushed it across the yard. Elias saw children near the smokehouse. He saw the flame curling toward dry crates. He saw William panic, truly panic, for the first time in his life. And Elias moved, not toward William, not toward revenge, toward the fire. He grabbed the burning crate, ignoring the flames licking his arms, and hurled it away from the buildings. He stomped the grass. He shoved the smoldering hay aside. Pain wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the memory of William's face, pale, trembling, red-eyed with humiliation. Elias had seen hatred in many men before, but William's hatred bore a different shape. It was childish, panicked, wounded pride, and wounded pride was more dangerous than cruelty. Cruel men killed quickly, embarrassed men killed slowly. A soft knock tapped on the cabin door. Elias didn't move at first, letting the sound repeat twice before he answered. When he opened the door, a small girl stood barefoot in the dirt, hair sticking to her damp cheeks. It was Sarah, 6 years old, quick-footed, always smiling. But tonight her eyes were wide with fear. "Mama sent me," she whispered in a trembling voice. She said, don't sleep, said stay awake, something's wrong." Elias crouched down to her level. "What's wrong, little bird?" Sarah's chin quivered. "Mrs. say William's mad, he been drinking with them riders. He said he gonna fix his shame." Elias felt a cold line of dread crawl down his spine. "Did she say more?" Sarah nodded. "She say they gonna come for somebody tonight, and they say your name." Elias's jaw clenched. He placed a hand on her shoulder gently. "Go back, tell your mama I heard her words." The girl nodded, turned, and sprinted into the night. Elias closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling slowly. His cabin, made of thin wood and hope, suddenly felt too small to contain the danger pressing against the night. William wouldn't come alone. He would come with men who needed no excuse to hurt someone, men who enjoyed the sport of hunting fear. Elias stood up, grabbed the small cloth bag hidden beneath his bed, and poured its contents onto the floor. A wooden spoon, a Bible missing its cover, a folded piece of leather with a name carved into it long ago, a smooth river stone that belonged to a man he once called father, though he barely remembered his face. It was everything he owned in the world. He didn't pack it. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked to the back of the cabin, lifted a loose floorboard, and removed a small bundle he had kept hidden for years. A worn pair of moccasins, hand-sewn by an old runaway who had died 2 winters ago. A small flint, a crude knife fashioned from an iron file. Survival tools, not possessions, warnings. Tools meant for a man who knew someday he would have to run. He tied the moccasins around his waist, slipped the flint into his pocket, tucked the blade against his calf. He had not planned to flee tonight. He had not planned to flee at all, but fate rarely waited for a man's plans. A sudden echo shattered the quiet, the distant crack of a whip. Elias froze. The sound came again, louder this time, accompanied by drunken whoops and laughter drifting through the trees. The smell of whiskey carried on the wind. The earth seemed to tighten beneath his feet. They were coming. Elias stepped outside into the darkness. The moon hung low and bruised, clouds sliding past like shadows running from something. He scanned the tree line. Movement flickered, torches bobbing in uneven rhythm. William wasn't hiding his approach. This wasn't punishment. It was showmanship. Elias turned toward the cabins. Through the windows he could see frightened faces, mothers gripping babies, men holding their breath. No one dared step outside. If they did, they'd be beaten too, maybe worse. Elias understood their fear. He didn't want them to fight for him. He didn't want their blood spilled in his name. As the torches grew nearer, he moved toward the woods, staying low, his muscles coiled and ready. But he didn't run, not yet. Running too soon would draw them straight into the cabins. Running too late would put him beneath their boots. He needed distance. A voice split the night. "Elias." William. Drunk. Slurred. Furious. "Come out, you bastard! Come out and face me!" Elias slipped deeper into the shadows of the trees. The men burst into the clearing, 6 of them, armed with whips, ropes, knives, and fire. Their torches cast wild shapes on the ground, monstrous silhouettes dancing in the grass. William stood at the center, red-faced, sweaty, eyes glassy with whiskey and rage. His left hand clutched a whip. His right hand held a gun, an old flintlock but deadly enough. "Where is he?" William spat. "Where's the hero? Where's the man who thinks he's too good to bow?" The others laughed. Elias crouched behind a fallen tree trunk, heartbeat steady, breath controlled. He scanned the group. 2 of the men were seasoned riders, quick on their feet. 3 were plantation drifters who took any excuse to spill blood. And William was unpredictable. One of the men, Josiah, broad-shouldered and stumbling, kicked open Elias's cabin door. "He's gone," he shouted. William's face twisted. "Find him! Drag him out! I want his knees in the dirt!" The men fanned out, torches cutting orange slashes through the dark. Elias moved as they moved, keeping their backs turned, sliding through the brush with the quiet of a fox. His mind calculated paths, distances, shadows. He mapped where each man stepped, how far their torches reached, how much noise they made. He could avoid them. He could escape clean. But then something happened that changed everything. A small cry broke from the cabin nearest the woods, Sarah's cabin. Elias's head snapped toward the sound. One of the drifters had wandered too close. He yanked open the door and grabbed Sarah's mother by the hair, dragging her toward the yard. Sarah ran after her, screaming, clutching her mother's dress. Elias's muscles tightened. This wasn't part of the plan. The man raised his hand, ready to strike the woman. Elias moved before thought could catch him. He burst from the shadows, silent as a predator, fast as a breaking storm. The drifter turned too late. Elias's hand clamped around the man's wrist, twisting until bone cracked like dry kindling. The scream tore through the night. Torches whipped around. "There he is! Get him!" Elias shoved the man aside and grabbed Sarah, lifting her away from danger. Her mother pulled her into her arms, sobbing. Elias met her eyes, held her gaze for one heartbeat, silently asking forgiveness for what was coming, for what he would unleash. Then he ran, not toward the woods, toward the men. Torches swung. Ropes snapped through the air. William raised his gun. Elias rolled behind a tree as the gunshot fractured the night, sparks bursting from the trunk. "Don't let him get away!" William shrieked. The riders charged. Elias sprinted through the underbrush, dodging roots and branches, heart hammering. Behind him came the thunder of boots, the roar of torches, the shouts of men hungry for blood. A whip cracked behind him, slicing the air where his back had been seconds before. Elias leapt over a fallen log. The woods swallowed him, moonlight flickering through the leaves like signals from an unseen hand. He reached the ravine, the steep drop that marked the edge of the plantation. He didn't slow. He jumped. He crashed down through brush and rock, rolling hard, pain exploding through his ribs. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He staggered to his feet and sprinted deeper into the forest. Above him, William reached the ravine's edge, breathless and furious. "Go after him," he screamed. "He's dead by sunrise. Do you hear me? Dead!" But Elias wasn't dead. He was gone. Gone into the wilderness. Gone into the place no white man dared follow for long. Gone into the mountains. And with every step he took, the quiet, patient part of him died a little more. Something else rose in its place, something shaped by fear, fire, and fury. He didn't know it yet. He didn't feel it fully. But the South would, by dawn, the slave who escaped would begin transforming into the mountain man they would all come to fear. The mountains had a way of swallowing sound, swallowing truth, swallowing the past. Yet even in their vast silence, whispers traveled. And by the winter of 1843, one whisper had grown into a legend that made plantation owners bolt their doors and hunters polish their rifles. They called him the Ghost of the Blue Ridge. They called him the Shadow Rider. They called him the Mountain Devil. But before all the names and the fearful stories, he had been a man with skin scarred by whips and a soul once filled with hope. Now, he was becoming something else entirely, something the South had never seen. After Caleb's escape from the plantation, after the blizzard that nearly froze the breath inside his lungs, he had begun to carve out a kind of existence among the ridges and hollows. But survival was only the beginning. There are men who run from the world, and there are men who rise above it. Caleb wasn't running anymore. With every passing day, with every mile climbed and every creature tracked, he was becoming the very thing the mountain demanded, a force shaped by hunger, cold, rage, and the memory of chains. The mountain was brutal in its teachings. Snow would fall unexpectedly and bury the traps he had set with aching fingers. Wolves would howl at night, circling his camp, testing the boundary between their hunger and their caution. Rivers froze into treacherous sheets of ice that could shatter beneath a careless step. And the wind, God, the wind, howled through the trees like a ghost choir, reminding him of every cry he'd ever heard in the slave quarters. Still, he learned. It started with noticing. The way a twig snapped differently if a deer passed over it versus a man. The way certain berries, poisonous to humans, could be boiled twice to extract enough nutrients to survive a lean week. The way smoke behaved differently in cold air, drifting eastward in the morning but flattening by dusk. The mountains had rules, and Caleb was beginning to decode them. One night, he found himself beneath an outcropping of rock that acted like a natural roof, shielding him from sleet. His fire was small, barely visible, as he roasted a rabbit he'd trapped hours earlier. He stared at the flames and thought about how far he'd come, and how far he had yet to go. The mountains stretched endlessly around him, but his past stretched everywhere too. He could feel it on his skin like an old bruise that refused to fade. He closed his eyes and saw the face of Isaac, the man who had shared the lash with him, who had whispered hope into the darkness of the slave quarters. Isaac had been more than a friend. He had been a brother, a tether to sanity, and the day Isaac was sold, Caleb felt something inside him tear. He hadn't stopped thinking about him since. Every time hunger gnawed at him, every time cold tried to claim him, every time he collapsed into exhausted sleep, he whispered Isaac's name like a prayer. He didn't know if Isaac was still alive, but he swore the mountains would not be his grave until he found out. Caleb was deep in memory when a branch snapped in the woods behind him. He didn't freeze. Freezing was death. Instead, his hand slid silently toward the sharpened spear beside him. His breath slowed, his ears strained. The forest had many sounds, but some sounds carried intent, footsteps that hesitated, breaths that tried to hide. A figure emerged at the tree line, lanky, cloaked in fur, moving with the slow confidence of a predator. The man's rifle was slung casually over his shoulder, but even in the dim light, Caleb sensed he could unsling it in a blink. Hiram Dalton, the hunter who'd been tracking him for weeks. Dalton wasn't like the others. Most men came into the mountains with ego and rifles and left with frostbite and regret. But Dalton had grown up in these ridges. He could track a bird mid-flight. He could smell fear, and he'd sworn to bring back the escaped Negro alive, or in pieces, because a plantation owner had offered a reward large enough to tempt even the mountain folk. Caleb didn't move. Dalton didn't speak. The fire crackled between them, tiny but bright. Dalton's lips curled into the faintest smirk. "So," he drawled, his voice low and cold, "you're the one they whisper about. The shadow, the runaway who outlived the blizzard. I'll admit, I expected someone bigger." Caleb said nothing. Words were wasted on men like Dalton. Dalton stepped closer. Caleb's grip tightened on the spear. His mind raced. He could lunge, but Dalton would shoot. He could run, but Dalton would track. The mountain suddenly felt small, the world shrinking to the circle of firelight between two men destined to destroy each other. Then another sound, a distant crack, not a branch, a rifle. Dalton stiffened, head snapping toward the trees. Caleb didn't waste the moment. He lunged sideways, grabbed a handful of snow, and smothered his fire. Darkness swallowed the camp. Dalton cursed and fired blindly where Caleb had been sitting, the shot exploding through the cold air. But Caleb was already gone, melting into the night like smoke. For hours, the chase twisted through the mountains. Caleb ran low and silent, moving from shadow to shadow. Dalton pursued with furious precision, tracking broken brush, faint footprints, and Caleb's warm body scent carried on the cold wind. The mountains watched the hunt with ancient indifference. At last, Caleb reached a narrow ravine carved by centuries of rainwater. He slid down the rock face, digging his fingers into cracks and roots until he dropped silently onto the floor below. A cave mouth yawned near the back. He'd found it days earlier and left a few supplies inside, just in case. Dalton appeared at the ravine's edge minutes later, panting lightly. "You run well," he muttered into the cold, "but everyone slips eventually." He began descending. Caleb ducked into the cave, heart hammering. The darkness hugged him like a second skin. He moved deeper, letting the cold stones swallow him whole. He listened, Dalton climbing down, boots scraping rock, breath steady. Caleb knew he couldn't outrun him forever. The hunter was too skilled, too relentless. If the mountain demanded a fight, then a fight was what it would get. He waited until Dalton's silhouette darkened the cave opening. Then Caleb hurled a rock the size of his fist. It struck the wall near Dalton's head, making the hunter flinch and raise his rifle. "What are you doing?" Dalton snarled, stepping inside. "You know you can't." Caleb didn't give him time to finish. He lunged from the shadows, shoulders slamming into Dalton's chest. The rifle clattered to the cave floor. The two men crashed into the stone wall, fighting like starving wolves. Dalton struck Caleb across the jaw. Caleb drove an elbow into Dalton's ribs. The cave filled with grunts, labored breaths, scraping boots, fists thudding flesh. Dalton grabbed Caleb by the throat and slammed him into the stone. Stars burst behind Caleb's eyes. The world swam. Dalton's fingers tightened. "You should have frozen in that snow," he hissed. Caleb's vision dimmed. The mountain felt distant. Time stretched. Then something primal surged through him. Survival, rage, memory. The scars on his back burned like fire. He seized a jagged rock from the cave floor and struck Dalton's forearm. The hunter yelped, grip loosening. Caleb gasped for air, then swung the rock again, this time across Dalton's skull. Dalton crumpled. Caleb stood over him, chest heaving, blood roaring in his ears. He waited for Dalton to move. Caleb didn't kill him. The mountain had taught him many things, but brutality for the sake of brutality wasn't one of them. Killing Dalton would bring more hunters, more attention, more danger. Instead, Caleb dragged the unconscious man to the ravine's entrance, took his knives, emptied the powder from his rifle, and left him with just enough supplies to make it out alive. As Caleb watched Dalton's limp body, he realized something. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was destiny bending itself around him, shaping him. He was no longer a runaway, no longer prey. He was becoming legend. And the mountains were only the beginning. The mountain wind cut through Caleb like a blade, sharp and cold, but he welcomed it. Each gust reminded him he was alive, that he had survived the whip, the fire, the relentless chase through the ridges, and the hunter's desperate grip. The forest stretched endlessly, a tangled web of roots, cliffs, and shadow. Yet Caleb no longer feared it. He had become part of it. Each step he took, each branch he bent, each leaf he brushed against seemed to acknowledge his presence, as if the mountain itself had claimed him. He moved silently, almost ghost-like, learning the language of the wilderness, the snapping twig that spoke of human pursuit, the rustle of leaves that hid predators, the way the fog curled around rocks to conceal paths. He had survived so far by listening, by watching, by letting instinct guide him. But instinct alone was no longer enough. The mountain demanded more: strategy, patience, and most of all, understanding the minds of those who sought him. By midday, Caleb had reached a ridge that overlooked a small valley. He crouched behind a boulder, surveying the open ground below. Smoke drifted lazily from a cabin several miles off, signaling human presence. Hunters, he suspected, looking for him, following the bounty that had grown like wildfire across the south. Caleb studied the ridge, counting likely paths, noting the direction of sunlight, the shadows cast by trees, the rocks that could provide cover. Each observation was a calculation, each breath a rhythm of survival. If he moved carelessly, if he misjudged even a single step, death could come swift and silent. He lowered his head, letting his dark hair brush the boulder's rough surface. The memory of his life on the plantation rose unbidden, the endless fields, the crack of whips, the hollow faces of those too beaten to dream. He remembered the laughter stolen by cruelty, the songs sung softly in secret, the whispered names of the dead and the sold. His body still carried the scars, and his soul bore the weight of every injustice. But those memories were not chains anymore. They were fire. They sharpened him, honed him, made him stronger. Every man who sought to destroy him underestimated the power of that fire. Every whip, every insult, every act of violence had tempered him into something new, something dangerous, something the South would soon learn to fear. He descended into the valley cautiously, moving through the underbrush, each step deliberate. His eyes caught the subtle movement of a fox, the quick flight of a hawk overhead, the bending of reeds in a gentle breeze. He had learned to see the world differently, to anticipate what others overlooked. Even the wind had meaning. Each gust carried information, whispers of hunters' movements, the scent of men, the faint trace of horses in the distance. Caleb's body had become a map of the mountains, every scar a reminder, every bruise a lesson. He was no longer the boy who endured punishment. He was the man who wielded the wilderness as a weapon. By nightfall he reached a hidden hollow, a place he had discovered while exploring weeks before. A stream ran through it, the water clear and cold, tumbling over rocks in a constant rhythm. Here he could rest, eat, and plan. He knelt by the water, cupping it in his hands, drinking slowly, feeling the cold bite of it on his tongue and throat. Hunger gnawed at him, but it was manageable. Pain, exhaustion, and hunger had become familiar companions, not enemies. They reminded him he was alive, and that he had survived far more than most could imagine. As he rested, he thought of the hunters who followed, the bounty that had grown so high it would tempt the most desperate men. The names whispered in the taverns of Savannah, Charleston, and Atlanta. Mountain Ghost, Shadow Rider, the Devil of the Appalachians, was starting to reach ears far beyond the ridges. People feared him, and that fear was powerful. But fear alone was not enough to survive. He had to become more than myth. He had to become something untouchable, something beyond pursuit. And to do that, he needed allies, knowledge, and the skill to outwit anyone foolish enough to enter his domain. Weeks passed. Caleb lived off the land, learning every nuance of the forests, valleys, and ridges. He fashioned traps, sharpened spears, and set snares for small game, learning how to sustain himself without leaving a trace. He discovered caves that could hide him, hidden paths that led to water and food, and natural barriers that would slow any pursuer. Each discovery was a victory. Each night spent alive a proof of his growing mastery over the mountains. He moved like a shadow, striking silently when necessary, disappearing before retaliation could come. Word of his survival spread. Hunters returned from the ridges with stories of a man who moved like smoke, who vanished like mist, who struck without warning and left no trace. The legend of the mountain ghost was no longer just talk, it was reality. But even legends had to be careful. Caleb knew that one mistake, one lapse in attention, could mean capture or death. He honed his senses, listening to the whispers of the forest, watching the signs of human presence, reading the tracks of animals and men alike. He knew that every footstep could be his last misstep if he wasn't vigilant, and yet, with every day that passed, his confidence grew. He had survived the plantation, the whips, the fire, the hunters. Nothing in the south had been able to claim him, and he was beginning to understand why. The mountains did not merely shelter him, they were shaping him, molding him into something unstoppable. One evening, as twilight painted the ridges in deep indigo and silver, Caleb spotted movement in the distance. A band of men, torches in hand, searching the forest floor for signs of him. Their approach was cautious, their voices low, but he could hear the crackle of leaves underfoot, the scent of smoke from their torches. He studied them, noting numbers, formation, and rhythm. This was different from previous hunters. They were organized, coordinated, they were determined. And determination was dangerous. Caleb crouched behind a thick stand of pines, waiting for the perfect moment. He could strike, but he didn't need to. These men were already afraid. The forest carried his reputation before him. They hesitated with every step, glanced over their shoulders, whispered curses and prayers. Fear worked in his favor. Fear made them predictable. Fear made them weak. He smiled faintly in the dim light. They would never catch him. Not tonight. Not ever. He moved silently, slipping behind their line, circling the hunters without making a sound. Each step was measured, each breath controlled, each motion deliberate. By the time they realized his presence, he was already gone, vanished into the shadows, leaving only the imprint of his passage and a legend that would grow with every telling. That night the hunters returned to their cabins in defeat, their courage shattered, their minds haunted by the shadow that had danced through the trees, invisible, untouchable, unstoppable. Caleb paused atop a ridge, looking down at the valley bathed in moonlight. The plantation and its horrors seemed distant now, part of another life, another world, but the fire of injustice still burned within him. He remembered the children, the mothers, the friends who had been sold or broken. He remembered the lash, the humiliation, the cruelty, and he promised himself that he would not only survive, he would become a force that no man could ignore. He would become a protector of those who had no one to protect them. He would become a reckoning for those who sought to dominate and destroy. The mountains stretched endlessly before him, each ridge, hollow, and cliff a part of his new domain. Caleb felt the pulse of the wilderness, the rhythm of the earth beneath his feet, the life that thrummed through the trees, the streams, the wind. He was no longer merely a man who had escaped, he was the mountain itself, patient, enduring, and unstoppable. Hunters would come, men with rifles, whips, and bounties, but none would claim him. Not now. Not ever. He settled for the night beneath a rock overhang, fire small and controlled, the stars above like pinholes in the vast darkness. The mountain was quiet, except for the soft rustle of leaves and the distant howl of a wolf. Caleb closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of his heartbeat, the flow of the wind, the whisper of the forest. Every sound was a lesson, every moment a survival test, every breath a victory, and somewhere deep inside, a new thought took root, a realization that the man he had been was gone, burned away by the fire, the whip, the hatred of the South. What remained was something greater, something untouchable, something that would change the mountains, the valleys, and the whispers in the taverns below. He would be feared. He would be respected. He would be remembered. By dawn, the first light painted the ridges in shades of gold and crimson. Caleb rose, stretched, and began moving again. The mountain had claimed him. The South had been warned. And the legend of the mountain ghost, the shadow rider, the devil of the Appalachians, was only beginning. The mountains had a rhythm, and Caleb had learned to move with it. The winds whispered, the streams hummed, and the trees creaked like old sentinels warning intruders. For weeks he had evaded hunters, evaded traps, and survived on nothing more than what the land grudgingly offered. Yet there was more to survival than merely hiding. To truly thrive in these high ridges, he needed guidance, community, knowledge that only those who had lived among these mountains for decades could provide. And the mountains, ever watchful, led him to it. It was on a grey morning, fog curling like spectral fingers along the ridges, that he first encountered them. At first he saw smoke rising in the distance, a thin trail, almost imperceptible against the mist. He approached cautiously, descending a hidden ravine, weaving through the tangled undergrowth. His instincts told him to stay hidden, to observe. But curiosity, a dangerous luxury, pushed him closer. As he crested a low ridge, he saw a settlement unlike anything he had imagined. Simple cabins made from stone and wood, smoke curling from chimneys, animals wandering freely, and most importantly, people moving with ease and confidence that spoke of generations living in harmony with the mountains. These were no ordinary folk. Their eyes were sharp, movements precise, muscles coiled from years of climbing cliffs, running ridges, and hunting for survival. They were Maroons, runaways, who had built a life untouchable by the laws below, invisible to the world that sought to enslave or destroy them. Caleb felt the tension in his body ease slightly. Here were men and women who understood what he had endured. Here were allies, not enemies. At first the Maroons observed him with suspicion. From the tree line he watched them, each shadowed figure alert, holding spears and bows, faces painted with streaks of ash or mud. He knew he could not reveal himself abruptly. He waited, moving quietly, mimicking the sounds of the wind, blending with the trees. Hours passed. Finally, an elder, a woman with hair like winter silver and eyes like sharpened flint, stepped forward. Her voice when she spoke was low and commanding, yet not unkind. "Come out, stranger, we see you." Caleb stepped forward slowly, hands raised slightly in respect, eyes steady. Every instinct screamed caution, but he knew that aggression here would be foolish. He revealed himself fully only when he saw that they meant no harm. The woman studied him, nodded, and turned toward the settlement. Others followed, surrounding him cautiously but with restrained curiosity. One of the younger men, muscular and tall, approached, eyes assessing, fingers brushing the hilt of a knife at his side. Caleb remained still. He did not speak. He did not move hastily. Every gesture was deliberate, every motion calculated. Finally, the silver-haired woman spoke again. "You run far, you fight well, but you are not ready alone. Come, eat, rest, learn. The mountains are patient, but they demand respect." Caleb followed them cautiously. Inside the settlement, he saw children laughing, women tending gardens, men sharpening blades or checking traps. Life had carved its own rhythm here. It was rough, yes, but it was free. The Maroons had created a world apart from cruelty and fear, a world that Caleb could understand and, perhaps, be a part of. Days turned into weeks. Caleb trained with them, learning every secret the mountains held. He learned how to read animal tracks, how to predict weather by the rustle of leaves and the flight of birds, how to find water hidden beneath rock faces and fallen trees. He learned how to set traps so subtle that even the keenest hunter could be fooled. And he learned strategy, not the blind rage of vengeance, but the cunning patience of someone who knew his terrain, his strengths and his enemies' weaknesses. He was becoming more than a survivor. He was becoming a master of the mountains. But survival was not enough. The mountains were dangerous, not only because of nature, but because of men. Hunters from below still sought him. Bounties were posted in taverns and on the edges of towns, calling for the capture of the so-called mountain ghost. Caleb understood that he could not remain hidden forever. To ensure his safety, he had to assert himself, to become a legend that could not be captured. And for that, he needed to understand both the wilderness and the fear it inspired in the hearts of men. One night, as the settlement slept, Caleb stood atop a ridge overlooking a valley bathed in silver moonlight. He could see the distant glimmer of a cabin torch far below. Hunters, perhaps, drawn by rumors of his presence. He studied the movement, noting paths, listening for patterns, recognizing mistakes. The forest itself seemed to guide him, teaching him, whispering secrets that only those who truly listened could understand. He felt the weight of the mountains in his bones, in the curve of his spine, in the ache of his legs, and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He was no longer just a man. He was part of the wilderness, an extension of the cliffs, the streams, the trees, and the mist. In the days that followed, Caleb began to explore beyond the settlement. He ventured into ravines no one dared tread, climbed ridges with sheer faces, and discovered hidden caves and natural fortresses. Each exploration increased his confidence, his mastery, his legend. When hunters stumbled upon a ruined cabin or a cleverly concealed trap, word spread. The stories grew, exaggerated and terrifying. Some claimed the mountain ghost could disappear into thin air. Others whispered that he controlled wolves and bears, that he could move like wind and strike like lightning. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied these tales. He let fear do his work. The Maroon settlement became a second home. They taught him not only survival but strategy, community, and leadership. Caleb absorbed every lesson, every technique, every story of resilience. He learned to trust again, to connect with others who had also suffered, and to understand that power was not just strength or violence. It was knowledge, patience, and cunning. The more he learned, the more he realized that he could protect not just himself, but those who could not defend themselves. Every hunter who sought him, every plantation owner who had claimed dominion over human lives, would learn that fear could be more potent than chains. Weeks later, a messenger arrived, a youth with a message scrawled on parchment: "The bounty grows, men speak your name. They say no man has escaped the mountains alive." Caleb read it slowly, eyes narrowing. He understood the opportunity and the danger. Fear could be wielded, but it could also invite attack. He had to remain one step ahead, to strike only when necessary, to let the mountains and his reputation do the work of protection and intimidation. That night, Caleb trained. He ran the ridges, leapt from rock to rock, moved silently through underbrush, tested traps, and practiced the art of stealth and precision. Each movement sharpened him. Each challenge hardened him. He was becoming a legend, yes, but more importantly, he was becoming unstoppable, untouchable, an embodiment of the mountains themselves. The Maroons watched him with respect and awe. They saw not only his skill but his resolve, the fire in his eyes, and the calm intelligence that guided every action. They began to tell their children of the new man in their midst, the one who could move unseen, strike without warning, and survive when others could not. Caleb's story intertwined with theirs, becoming part of the living legend of the mountains. But Caleb knew the greatest test was yet to come. The hunters would not give up. They would come with greater numbers, greater weapons, greater cunning, and when they did, he had to be ready, not merely to survive, but to dominate, to become the force that every man below feared. The mountain ghost could not remain a shadow forever. He had to become something more, a protector, a reckoning, a myth alive, walking among the ridges, untouchable and eternal. As dawn broke, casting a golden light across the peaks, Caleb stood atop a cliff, arms stretched slightly, eyes scanning the horizon. The mountains were silent but alive. The valley below stirred with life. The world beyond was cruel, hungry, and unrelenting. But up here, in these ridges and ravines, Caleb had found power, knowledge, community, and purpose. He was no longer just a man who had escaped. He was a force that would reshape fear itself, and the South would learn, soon enough, that some shadows are born not to hide, but to rule. The mountains were waking. Winter had loosened its grip, but the chill still lingered in the ridges and hollows, curling around rocks and trees like a ghost. Caleb had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the seasons, to the whispers of wind through the branches, to the way snow and frost dictated movement and survival. But this morning was different. The air carried a tension he had not felt in months, a hum beneath the rustle of leaves, a vibration that crawled through the soil and into his bones. Something was coming, something more dangerous than the hunters who had stalked him weeks before, something the bounty had summoned that no legend, no skill, no mountain could easily contain. He spotted the first signs at dawn. Horses' hoofprints on a faint trail, disturbed brush, the sharp tang of smoke carried by the wind. This was no ordinary party of hunters. There were 10 men, well-armed, organized, moving with purpose. They had come for him, not for glory, not for chance. They had come for the mountain ghost. And Caleb crouched atop a ridge, studied them carefully, noting the spacing, the speed, the rhythm of their steps. Every instinct screamed alert, every muscle tensed for the dance that survival demanded. He could have vanished into the thick forest, melted into the mist, become one with shadow. But Caleb was no longer merely surviving, he was asserting dominance over the land he had claimed. The hunters would learn that fear was not an accident, it was a tool, and he wielded it like a blade. He dropped silently from the ridge, moving behind fallen logs, using shadows as allies, tracing paths only he knew. The hunters moved in formation below, their confidence masking the tension that Caleb knew would unravel if tested properly. Hours passed, each breath and step deliberate. Caleb observed their patterns, studied their pauses, anticipated their moves. He left subtle signs, broken branches, displaced stones, tracks designed to mislead, false trails that would send men in circles. The mountains had taught him more than survival. They had taught him strategy, patience, and deception. And as the sun rose higher, illuminating valleys and ridges in harsh light, Caleb began the hunt. The mountain ghost would not merely evade, he would dominate, striking fear into those who sought to claim him. The first encounter came in the narrow gorge, where the stream cut through ancient rock. Caleb had waited hours, hidden behind a boulder that jutted like a sentry over the ravine. One of the hunters, a man broad-shouldered and overconfident, followed the false trail Caleb had set, unaware of the subtle tripwire tied to a hidden branch. With a soft snap, the hunter stumbled, his rifle clattering against the rocks below. The sound echoed, and Caleb struck, a flurry of motion, disarming the man, using his own weight and momentum to throw him into the river below. The other hunters froze, unsure of what had happened, senses screaming warning, but hesitation was deadly, and hesitation was Caleb's weapon. He moved from shadow to shadow, cutting paths through trees, disappearing behind rocks, using terrain to his advantage. Every step was a message, a warning, a lesson to those who dared intrude. By midday, 2 more hunters had been ensnared in traps he had set, restrained but unharmed, a warning, not a death. Fear was his ally, terror was his strategy. By evening, the remaining men were scattered, demoralized, exhausted, and increasingly aware that the mountain ghost was not merely a myth. He was real, and he was everywhere and nowhere at once. Caleb paused atop a ridge, watching as the hunters regrouped in the valley below. Their confidence had crumbled. Every glance upward, every twitch of muscle revealed the panic that crept into even the bravest hearts. He smiled faintly. This was the power of legend, the power of fear intertwined with skill. They had come for him expecting a man. They would leave haunted by a shadow, by the weight of the mountains themselves, by the realization that some predators cannot be captured or killed, only respected or feared. As night fell, Caleb returned to the maroon settlement, moving with quiet grace. The people there had watched his maneuvers from hidden vantage points, learning, absorbing, and understanding that the mountain ghost was more than a protector. He was a symbol, a force, a reckoning. Children whispered his name in awe. Women shared stories of his courage around the fire. The elders nodded approvingly, recognizing in him the fusion of skill, cunning, and survival instinct that had kept their communities safe for generations. Caleb understood the responsibility now resting on his shoulders. He was not only defending himself, he was defending a sanctuary, a way of life, and the very legend of freedom that the mountains offered. In the days that followed, word of his exploits spread beyond the ridges. Taverns in nearby towns buzzed with rumors of the mountain ghost, the shadow rider, the man who could strike without warning and vanish like smoke. Plantation owners whispered warnings to each other. Hunters shared fearful tales of disappearing men and mysterious traps that left no trace. Every story, every exaggeration amplified his presence, solidifying the aura of terror that surrounded him. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied the stories. He allowed the fear to grow, to mutate, to become unstoppable. Fear, he knew, could travel faster than men on horseback, and it could reach corners of the south that even his own legs could not. One evening, a rider approached the settlement alone, pale and sweating, clutching a letter addressed to Caleb. The man dismounted, hands shaking. Caleb accepted the parchment, reading quickly. It was from a wealthy plantation owner, offering a bounty larger than any Caleb had ever seen. Thousands of dollars, more than enough to buy freedom for himself, the maroon settlement, and hundreds of others. The letter promised pursuit, but also flattery, praise for skill, acknowledgement of cunning, and a warning that men were coming with better arms, more men, and relentless determination. Caleb folded the letter, letting the firelight dance across his eyes. The bounty was growing, the threat escalating, but so was his mastery, his strategy, his understanding of the mountains and of fear. He returned the rider to the edge of the settlement with a warning. "Tell your master, the mountains are patient and so am I. The ghost is not just a man, he is the ridge, the hollow, the mist, he cannot be captured." The rider nodded, terror evident in his pale eyes, and departed into the night. Caleb watched until he disappeared, feeling the weight of both responsibility and power. The bounty had grown, yes, but so had he. The legend would only become stronger. Caleb spent the following weeks training, preparing, refining his strategies. He taught the younger Maroons the lessons he had learned, the importance of patience, of observation, of blending with the land, of using fear as both shield and weapon. He set traps across the ridges, reinforced the caves, and created hidden paths that could only be navigated by those who truly understood the mountains. He was no longer just a man who survived. He was a teacher, a leader, a protector. The mountain ghost had become a symbol, a force that transcended a single life, an embodiment of vengeance, freedom, and the unstoppable power of the human spirit when driven by justice and survival. By the end of the month, the hunters returned, this time with more men, more arms, more determination. They scoured valleys, searched ravines, and called out names into the wind, but Caleb was already several steps ahead. Traps disabled horses, misdirected groups, and left men stranded or humiliated. Every encounter reinforced the myth, every retreat solidified fear. Caleb watched from the ridges, controlling the flow of the hunt with precision, a conductor orchestrating terror and chaos without directly engaging in combat. The mountain ghost had become untouchable, a shadow in the trees, a whisper in the wind, a force that no mortal could control. Night fell again. The hunters, exhausted and defeated, abandoned the hunt, leaving behind broken equipment, fear and rumors that would grow for years to come. Caleb stood atop a cliff, overlooking the valley below, the wind in his hair, the moon illuminating the ridges like a silver crown. He was alone, yes, but not lonely. He was part of the mountains now, inseparable from the forests, streams and shadows. He had transformed, becoming more than a man. He was a living legend, feared, respected and untouchable. The South would never forget the name, the mountain ghost. The shadow rider, the man who had escaped the whip, the fire and death itself, only to rise from the mountains as an unstoppable force, and as dawn painted the peaks in gold and crimson, Caleb felt a calm settle over him. The legend had grown, the bounty had risen, and the mountains had claimed him completely. Nothing below could touch him, nothing above could deter him. He was eternal in the ridges, immortal in the valleys, a force of nature and vengeance, a protector of the free, a reckoning for the cruel. The South had learned the truth. The mountain ghost was no mere man. He was the mountain itself. The bounty on Caleb's head had grown to a staggering sum, whispered in taverns and markets alike, carried on the lips of men who feared the mountains as much as the mountain ghost himself. With every retelling, his legend swelled, distorted, exaggerated, terrifying. Some claimed he could vanish into thin air, strike like lightning, and leave not a trace. Others swore he commanded the animals of the ridges, that the wind itself obeyed his will. Caleb neither confirmed nor denied these tales. He knew the power of fear, and he wielded it as carefully as a weapon. It was not merely survival that drove him now, it was control, mastery, and the shaping of a domain where no man could dare enter without consequence. The mountains were no longer just a refuge, they were his kingdom, and he, its undisputed lord. Weeks passed, and Caleb moved with deliberate purpose. Each ridge, hollow and stream became a node in his map, a strategic position from which he could observe and control the movements of any who sought him. He had learned patience, he had learned calculation. Every footstep of a pursuer, every rustle of leaves, every crack of distant timber was noted, analyzed, and stored in his memory. The hunters had underestimated him, and they would continue to do so, but Caleb knew that human determination could be as relentless as the mountains themselves. He had to be proactive, not reactive. The mountain ghost could not merely evade. He had to assert his power in ways that would ensure lasting security. It was during this time that he began to consolidate a network of allies. The Maroon settlement had grown wary of newcomers, but Caleb's influence, his skill, and the aura of his legend opened doors that had been closed for generations. He brought survivors from other plantations, skilled hunters, trackers, and even runaway children into the fold. Under his guidance, they learned to move like shadows, to strike silently, to vanish into the forest, and to use the terrain as a weapon. They were no longer desperate survivors. They were a covert force, a hidden militia of the mountains, and Caleb, through discipline and leadership, had become their commander. Fear and respect intertwined around him, making him both protector and symbol, teacher and myth. The community began to thrive, relying on his strategy, trusting in his judgment, and understanding that rebellion could be a tool as much as defense. One afternoon, as Caleb observed a valley from a high ridge, he noticed smoke rising from a distant cabin, a signal, faint but distinct. Someone had made camp in his territory. He descended cautiously, moving like wind through the underbrush, analyzing the path, the direction, the likely intentions of the occupants. He found a small hunting party, unaware of his approach, confident in their numbers, but blind to his mastery of the terrain. He watched them for hours, studying their weaknesses, noting their patterns, and waiting for the perfect moment to assert dominance. His interventions were subtle, leaving signs, creating false tracks, disabling equipment, and occasionally letting a lone man glimpse a shadow moving just out of reach. Panic set in slowly, methodically. By nightfall, the hunters fled, terrified, convinced they had seen the mountain ghost in ways no mortal could comprehend. Caleb's reputation had expanded once more, spreading farther and faster than he could have ever achieved through action alone. Myth and reality had begun to merge. But power always comes with responsibility. Caleb's growing influence required careful management. He could no longer act alone. He needed a structure, a plan, a method to channel the abilities of his followers while ensuring the safety of all within the mountains. He established patrols along key ridges, secret caches of supplies, and hidden escape routes. Every action was calculated, every detail deliberate. He trained his followers not only in survival but in strategy, deception, and psychological warfare. Fear would be their tool, secrecy their shield. They learned to communicate with signals, to anticipate threats, and to act as one cohesive force. Under Caleb's leadership, the mountain ghost was no longer a solitary legend. He was the figurehead of an organized, unstoppable presence that transformed the mountains into a fortress of shadows. The months rolled on, and the hunters grew bolder, desperation etched into their faces. Yet every attempt to capture him ended in failure. Some were trapped, disarmed, or humiliated. Others vanished without explanation, leaving rumors to grow wilder, darker. And through it all, Caleb observed, refined, and expanded his domain. He carved paths, reinforced caves, and established observation points that gave him near-complete knowledge of the movements in and around the ridges. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire with him, guiding his steps, shielding his movements, amplifying his presence. He was no longer a man merely surviving. He was a force shaping the land, controlling the narrative, bending fear to his will. One evening, as fog curled around the ridges and moonlight filtered through the mist like silver blades, Caleb met with the elders of the Maroon settlement. They gathered in a secluded hollow, fires low, voices hushed. He spoke of the future, of expansion, of the need for vigilance, and of the responsibility he now carried. He emphasized discipline, patience, and unity, reminding them that the mountains were both sanctuary and weapon. They listened intently, absorbing every word, understanding that the mountain ghost was no longer a name. They were living the legend alongside him. The power of reputation became an ally of unmatched strength. Stories of Caleb's exploits traveled faster than any messenger could ride. Plantation owners trembled at the mention of his name. Hunters debated, argued, and ultimately feared their own pursuit. The mountain ghost had become intangible, omnipresent, and unstoppable, a shadow that could strike anywhere, any time, leaving only fear and chaos in its wake. Every man who attempted to follow him discovered that the mountains were not merely terrain, but a participant, an accomplice, a weapon. And in that realization, Caleb's power grew exponentially, for no army could control what it could not comprehend. Winter approached again, the ridges blanketed in snow, streams freezing under the cold, wind cutting through clothing and flesh alike. But Caleb had adapted. He had mastered movement, camouflage, and survival in all conditions. The hunters who had once thought themselves capable were now humbled, some broken, some lost, and many too terrified to return. Caleb's legend continued to grow, intertwining fact and myth until the line between them was imperceptible. He was no longer simply a man evading capture. He was a force of nature, a living embodiment of the mountains, the wind, the shadows, and the whispers carried through ridges and valleys. One night, perched atop a high cliff, Caleb surveyed the horizon. The ridges stretched endlessly, the moon illuminating each peak and hollow. Below, the fires of distant settlements flickered like dying stars, unaware of the legend that moved above them. He felt the weight of his influence, the responsibility to those who had trusted him, and the knowledge that the South itself was beginning to take note. Fear had become his ally, skill his shield, and the mountains his domain. He was untouchable. He was inevitable. He was the mountain ghost, the shadow rider, the untamed force that would shape the land and the legend for years to come. By dawn, Caleb descended into the valley below, guiding his followers, preparing for future threats, and expanding his territory. Every step was deliberate, every action a lesson, every encounter a reinforcement of his dominance. The South would never forget the mountain ghost, for he was no longer a mere man fleeing oppression. He was the mountains incarnate, a living, breathing legend whose influence would endure long after the echoes of rifles and whips faded into history. The mountains had claimed him, molded him, and empowered him. And in that power, Caleb had become more than survivor. He had become a ruler, a myth, and an unstoppable force. The snow had melted from the ridges, leaving behind damp earth, muddy streams, and the faint scent of renewal. Caleb stood atop the highest peak, the wind tugging at his hair, the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction. He had survived storms, hunters, betrayal, and exhaustion, but none of that mattered now. He was no longer a man running from chains or bullets. He was the mountain ghost, the shadow rider, the untouchable force whose presence shaped every ridge, hollow, and valley. His legend had spread far and wide, carried by fearful whispers, terrified merchants and trembling plantation owners. And yet, for Caleb, this was not enough. Survival had been the first step, mastery was the second, and now he sought legacy, the assurance that long after he vanished into the mist, the mountains themselves would remember him. The maroon settlement below had grown into a formidable enclave. Hidden paths and natural barriers protected it, but it was more than shelter. It was a symbol, a sanctuary for those who had been enslaved, oppressed, or hunted. Under Caleb's guidance, men and women had learned to move silently, to fight strategically, and to use fear as both shield and weapon. Children had been taught to respect the land, to read the signs in the wind and trees, to listen to whispers of danger carried through the forest. Caleb had become more than a protector. He was a teacher, a strategist, a commander whose name alone inspired awe and terror. Every man who pursued him now knew that they faced not only a skilled fighter, but a master of psychological warfare, an architect of the impossible, and a shadow that could strike anywhere without warning. One evening, as twilight draped the ridges in purples and golds, Caleb observed movement far below. A new hunting party had ventured into the mountains, drawn by rumors of the mountain ghost and the enormous bounty attached to his capture. There were 15 men this time, heavily armed and confident, their faces alight with expectation and arrogance. Caleb narrowed his eyes. They were unprepared, ill-informed, and unworthy of the prize they sought. Their confidence would be their undoing, their fear their downfall. He studied their formation, noting their spacing, the angle of the sun, the direction of the wind. Every step they took into his domain was anticipated, every breath calculated. He descended silently into the forest, using the cover of thick underbrush and ancient trees to maneuver. Each step was deliberate, each movement precise. He left false tracks, displaced rocks, and broken branches to mislead them, guiding them deeper into confusion. Hours passed. The hunters grew weary, frustrated, and increasingly fearful. Panic crept into their ranks, whispering that the shadows themselves moved against them, that the mountain ghost was everywhere and nowhere at once. And Caleb, perched above them, watched with a calm that only mastery could bring. He was no longer merely a man, he was the embodiment of the mountain's wrath and wisdom, a force that could not be captured, negotiated with, or tamed. By nightfall, the hunters were scattered, disoriented, and terrified. 2 had stumbled into a trap Caleb had meticulously prepared, restrained but unharmed, serving as a warning to the others. By the time the remaining men realized the futility of their pursuit, they were already retreating, leaving behind their equipment and a growing sense of dread. Word of this encounter would spread like wildfire, amplifying the legend of the mountain ghost and ensuring that fear traveled faster than any rider could ever hope. Caleb had achieved more than survival or victory. He had cemented his reputation, his myth, and his influence over both the mountains and the world below. In the weeks that followed, Caleb focused on consolidation. He reinforced the settlement, explored hidden passages and caves, and trained his followers in the arts of stealth, strategy, and survival. Each day, the community grew stronger, more confident, and more unified under his guidance. He established networks of observation, creating vantage points that allowed him to monitor movement for miles in every direction. The mountains were no longer merely a refuge, they were his dominion. Every ridge, every hollow, every stream under his subtle control. Hunters who entered his territory felt the weight of history pressing against them, a force that was at once invisible and overwhelming. But power carried responsibility. Caleb understood that every decision, every act, and every omission could have consequences. He disciplined his followers not only in the use of weapons, but in patience, observation, and restraint. He emphasized the importance of leaving no trace, of blending seamlessly with the environment, and of striking fear without unnecessary bloodshed. The community respected him not solely for his skill, but for his wisdom, his foresight, and his ability to transform fear into strategy, strategy into safety, and safety into legend. News of the mountain ghost reached far beyond the mountains, carried by merchants, travelers, and terrified hunters. Plantation owners whispered of him in fear, exaggerating his powers and creating a myth that seemed to grow larger with every retelling. Some claimed he could move like mist, vanish into thin air, and strike without warning. Others swore he commanded the animals of the mountains, that wolves